We have to separate the multi into cultures, because one of the points really is that when we talk about multiculturalism, the first thing that people say is, when you ask people what it means, they say, oh, it's many cultures. So it's like the descriptive term. But it requires us to unpack the idea of culture, which is why we asked you to talk about culture. And if it was simply a case of just many cultures, it wouldn't be too hard, except that when we think about what culture means, we actually open up a bigger minefield. Okay? So what is culture? Raymond Williams, a very famous cultural studies academic, said famously that culture is one of the 2 or 3 most complicated words in the English language. And he has written extensively on the idea and developed, kind of quite detailed arguments and lists about the variations of the idea of culture. Prior to him, about 50 years ago, 2 academics actually kind of went around documenting and collecting different meanings of the word culture, and they came up with 50 or 60 different meanings, different variations in the meaning. Okay? Again, and this is not just a semantic problem, because it actually means a couple of significant things. Culture, as Williams points out, begins as a noun of process, as in the idea of cultivation, which comes down to us nowadays in things like yogurt culture, which multiculturalism tends not to deal with. And it breaks down, over the course of a couple of centuries, it breaks down into 2 areas. The kind of the anthropological meaning of culture as a whole way of life, and the arts side of things, which is the cultivation of the mind. Now, this kind of bifurcation of the meaning of culture is important because it divides things that you, in your definitions, were in fact trying to hold together. So if we have culture as a whole way of life, as in anthropology, we're implying a kind of a collective experience of culture. Culture is about a group of people, okay? A community. But the focus on the cultivation of the mind is primarily individual, even psychic or psychological or internal to the individual. So we use culture then in 2 quite distinct ways, as a collective thing and as an individual thing. Now, the thing about the whole way of life idea is that culture becomes a kind of a thing. Okay? It goes away from being a noun of process and talks about a form of classification of a group of people. So we talk about cultures. There's this culture and then that culture. In contrast, the cultivation of the mind idea in fact sees culture as a process of development, so it maintains its kind of processual nature. The whole way of life idea ends up focusing on what we'll call the folkish understanding of culture, kind of everyday life, the people as a whole. The cultivation of the mind idea focuses really on the experiences of the elite, of culture, cultural practices, artistic practices. And lastly, the anthropological idea implies a kind of culture as a stable social entity. So we can talk about certain cultures as though they're relatively timeless or ongoing. And yet, at the same time, as I was trying to say before, much of what we talk about culture is in fact quite dynamic, changing, evolving. The culture of Australia, for example, if we can use that term, is very different to what it was 20, 30, 40 years ago. Now, one fundamental idea that comes out of these series of problems is the community and the identity problem. Culture is community and culture is an identity. And it's a really difficult one. I just want to throw up one dimension of it, because it came out in a kind of comment that somebody made to me the other day, not the other day, some time ago, when they said that they had one Sudanese kid in the school. Okay? Now, this doesn't make sense if you have culture as a whole way of life idea of culture, because once you take the individual out of that whole way of life doesn't exist in the school. So when you say we have one Sudanese kid, what you mean is we have one kid of Sudanese origin, which is quite different to the idea of a whole way of life. We can't import whole ways of life into Australia. And this is a point that was made many years ago by Mary Kalantzis and Bill Cope and some other people, where they talked about a really deep anthropological notion of culture is in fact problematic for multiculturalism. That in terms of Australia, for example, there have really only been 2 cultures in that very profound sense, Western culture and Indigenous culture. And when migrants come here, they in fact can't bring their whole way of life with them. And they give the example of the Lebanese peasant who can't import their peasant agricultural modes of living. So there's a kind of a problem here about, what that means for multiculturalism. It also links to the problem of how stable then is this category of culture. It's about tradition and change, it's about collectives and individuals, so on and so forth. And part of the problem is that sometimes we associate cultures with nations, and it's a problem that will come up later on with ethnicity in particular. So nations for a long time have prided themselves on having a particular kind of culture, and yet we can look closely within nations to find that all sorts of groups also claim to have a culture, not just in terms of ethnicities, but things like subcultures. We talk about urban and rural cultures, we talk about class cultures, we talk about the culture of consumerism, we talk about workplace and corporate cultures, we even talk about a culture of inquiry. And the problem with culture here is that, well, there are 2 points to be made from it. Culture is not just about ethnicity, it's about a whole range of processes, and practices and relations. Not just about ethnicity, it's also about things like gender and class and so on. Some reference before to that, the idea of structures is getting, in one of the definitions, is getting towards that recognition. But it's an overused word. It's become very, very big, where businesses talk about having a culture. And why that's important is not just that it's a badly used word, but it refers to what one scholar has called the expediency of culture. And by that, Giudice means that culture has become so big it's being used to explain things, okay? It's being used to explain behaviours, values, customs, and etc. But the point he and other people have pointed out is that given that whole ways of life are economic and political, for example, and not just culture, that culture is often used to explain things that are, say, economic in origin, like inequalities. The logical step of that is that culture has become used to explain particular kinds of social problems. So, and I work in the area of dealing with the Lebanese community, that culture has been used to explain the problem of young Lebanese boys. So the experience of culture is that we use culture now to explain things which may not be explained by culture. And one of the examples that we use in the CPLP report is the problematic category of learning styles, okay? Which I don't want to kind of develop now, but culture is often used to explain the learning outcomes and learning styles of particular kids.